Everyone, welcome to the Bible study. It's season 2 and it's episode 2. We're in the Gospel of Mark. And speaking of Mark, I'm joined by my good friend Mark Clark, all the way from Canada.
Yes, sir. Hello again.
Good to see you. And Mark's going to join us again just in a couple of minutes after we look at context and we dive into the text. So let's look at context. Today we're going to be looking at the end of Mark chapter 2 and then going into Mark chapter 3. And I just want to try and get you familiar again with the Gospel of Mark. It's the shortest Gospel, but also it was the earliest Gospel. And you need to consider this, that Mark's Gospel dropped into our world probably around AD 65. And the Roman Caesar at that time was a guy called Nero. And all you need to know is he was a bad guy, everybody. A bad guy. And he was the guy that basically was bad with his family, bad with the empire, and also really, really persecuted the Christians. And they needed hope. And Mark brought that through his account. He tells an incredible story. Actually, it was said, and Mark has been described as one who cannot tell a story badly. He jumps right into it with 4 parts. Part number 1 is basically like an Avengers Marvel movie. There's no slow ramp up. It is straight into it. Jesus goes public with his announcement of the kingdom, and it's rapid fire with the disciples, driving out demons, healing the sick, and announcing the coming of God's rule. Then in part 2, in chapter 3, verse 7 through to chapter 8, 21, Mark develops the role of 3 significant groups. Jesus' miracles and teaching are sources of constant amazement to all of the crowds. And then the disciples receive private instruction and join in the proclamation, but like you and I, they're quite slow to capture everything. And then finally, there's like the other sort of section of people. It's the opposition which mounts. And then in part 3, that's chapter 8, verses 22 through to chapter 10, 45, Jesus directs his teaching and attention primarily to the disciples. And then the final section, part 4, chapter 10, 46 through to 15, 47, really covers at that point the story of the climax. And you all know that, the crucifixion, the death of Jesus, and then his resurrection. So in 4 main parts. In this session, we're going to be mainly in part 1. So a very, very important book for us. You're going to see this as well, is that Mark starts in his gospel almost immediately with opposition. And you would have heard it from Kurt and Dina. When Jesus is hanging out with these sinners, the religious people, they are not happy at all. And in our text, Jesus goes on to upset the religious ruling authorities even more when he doesn't fully respect in their minds the Sabbath. And you and I need to understand, for the mind of a Jew, the Sabbath is so important, even to Orthodox Jews to this day. I remember being in Jerusalem and there was a special elevator. There was 3 elevators, just regular elevators where you'd walk in like we normally do here, and you just press your button, you go to that floor. But there's another elevator that just keeps stopping at every floor, floor. And why? Because on the Sabbath, the Orthodox Jew doesn't even want to press the button at that point. That person could just walk into the elevator and they just wait until it comes to their floor. The Sabbath was a really big deal. So to explain how Jesus interacted with the Sabbath and with the religious leaders of the day, it's over to Mark. And Mark, you take us through this.
All right, yeah. So obviously, like you said, this was one of the big ideas that Jews lived by at the time. And so here's Jesus coming in, and he's starting to kind of shake everybody up a bit. He's starting to do things that overthrow people's ideas about what the true Messiah was, what the kingdom looked like. And they had all these religious rituals all set up. And almost like a modern day revolutionary or a guy who just kind of I remember my wife and I went and watched the Gospel of John. It's a 3-hour movie, and we're watching it. And she just looked at me halfway through. She's like, I kind of understand why they killed this guy. You know, he's like, everything he's saying it just ticks everybody off, and he's relentless. He just goes and he goes and he keeps putting them almost on trial, or their hearts, whether they understand what God's really about in the world. And of course, they have all those structures set up, and now he comes and he does this. So we're just going to look at chapter 2, verse 23 to 3, verse 6. That's the little section, and it's two very similar things happen. So it says this, verse 23. One Sabbath, which Andrew just described what Sabbath was, it was, of course, given in the 10 Commandments. You were supposed to work 6 days and then rest. And of course, God had set that up in kind of a creational model, right? So he had set up a rhythm. He didn't rest because he was tired. I mean, obviously, he's God. He's all powerful. He was creating a rhythm for us in the way that we work, that we're supposed to work and work and work and then rest. And that's the reality that they had. And they would do it from Friday night to Saturday night. That was their 24-hour Sabbath rest, or what modern Jews call Shabbat. Actually, I was reading an article the other day about a kid who wants to become a major league baseball player, and he's supposedly amazing, but he's an Orthodox Jew, and he won't play baseball on Sunday, on Friday night to Saturday night, and he's hoping to become the first major league baseball player who actually says, I'm not going to play baseball from Friday night to Saturday, and I'm actually going to observe Sabbath, Shabbat. It's amazing to have that kind of dedication. So they loved that. They were like, this is a true, faithful way to interpret the Bible and live your life. These people weren't anti-Bible. They were pro-Bible. They were so pro-Bible that they paid attention to this by the book. And so that's the setting. So it says, on Sabbath, he, meaning Jesus, was going through the grain fields. And as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. I love Mark's as Andrew just said, he's such a good storyteller. He doesn't waste words. These guys are going around, traveling around Galilee, and he walks through and he starts plucking, or they start plucking grain off these in this grain field, plucking heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, now, why are the Pharisees? Okay, so first off, the Pharisees, they were not an official group that was recognized as these guys are elected officials to shepherd us. This was just a powerful group of people who paid attention to the law and said that if we can obey if Israel as a whole could obey all the laws of God for 2 Sabbaths in a row, the kingdom of God will come. So this is why they were such sticklers of everybody has to follow the rules. You know people like this in your life, right? The religious legalists, in a sense, that they're. I was talking to a church planter, and Andrew and I get to speak with church planters around the world. And I was talking to one recently, and he said that he planted his church and he would preach his sermons. And there was a guy who walked up to him and said, if you go over 30 minutes, I will turn my chair around and face the back wall out of protest, because no sermon should go over 30 minutes. And this guy would have to look at this guy. Now, I'm sure that came from some heart where at some point in the distant past, he thought this was good for people, but it became this rule that ruined the guy's life, ruined his heart, made him shrivel, made him demonize other people. And this is what happens. And this is what happened to the Pharisees. They weren't malicious. And this is dangerous, and we can get into this in the application section, Andrew, but the dangerous part is you don't have to sit around and be evil to be evil. You don't have to be sit around and twist your mustache and try to figure out how can I mess people up to actually derail people's life and keep them far from God. You can have really good intentions and be a really strict religious person and be far from God. So here were these Pharisees, and they were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, why these guys are creeping along the grain fields, with their binoculars, watching the disciples and Jesus, it's kind of crazy. But I'll give you some context here to something very interesting, and you can go look it up later. These are 2 stories that finish off what scholars have called the controversy section of the Gospel of Mark, which is, if you go back to the beginning of chapter 2, Jesus basically does a series of things that create controversy. And so if you look at chapter 2, verse 7, I'm going to show you a bunch of questions. If you just read through the text, you have all these questions that these people are asking. Why does this man speak like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And then down in chapter 2, verse 16, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Verse 18, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And now in our text, why are they doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? See what these people are doing? This is a series of questions that Mark hones in on and says, basically, this is a whole section of controversy. And if you're trying to figure out why Mark does that, the gospel writers really had a freedom to gather certain stories in certain. So Mark puts all of his healings in chapter 1. He puts all of his parables in chapter 4. And when skeptics come and they say, well, that's not right, the gospels are making things up. No. And I'm going to give you another example of this in a bit, but this is the freedom the gospel writers actually had. So these aren't reasons to actually say we shouldn't trust the Bible. It's actually reasons to trust the Bible. So a series of questions that get raised by the crowds that Jesus has to answer. So here they go, why are your guys not being lawful on the Sabbath? Because they're picking grain. And he said to them, have you never read what David did? When he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him. And what he's appealing to is a passage in 1 Samuel chapter 21. You can go and read it later, from chapters 1 all the way down to chapter 6, where David and his compadres, now it's very interesting because there's so much depth you could go into. Listen, 1 Samuel is the story of the true king of Israel. Now follow this narrative, who's been anointed but not yet recognized, traveling around with a motley crew of followers all around Israel, doing things that are upsetting the people who are in charge. And no one's really recognized him yet as the true king. This is literally what Jesus is doing in this passage. He's been anointed in chapter 1 in his baptism. Now he's got this motley crew and they're running around and they're just doing stuff all over Israel, but no one knows he's going, hey guys, remember the story about this king? And no one knew who he was. And he had this group of guys he was running around the wilderness with. And he says, remember when he was in need and was hungry, verse 25, he and those who were with him, hint, hint, I got guys with me. David had guys with him. How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest. Now just underline that, I'll come back to that. And ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, so basically what he's saying is there's this very famous story, 1 Samuel chapter 21, that you guys will know. David was running around. They got hungry. They go to the priest. They say, can we eat bread? The priest says, hey, man, this bread is just for me. I'm the priest. It's the special bread. It's the bread of the presence. And yet the priest actually gave it to David and his disciples, his followers. And he actually says to him, just make sure that your guys aren't sleeping around with women, that their lives are actually pretty pure. And David's like, yep, you know me, whenever I travel around, we don't go around and sleep with women. Go read the story. It's very fascinating. And then he goes, so we're pure enough. You can give us the bread. And he gives them the bread. And the point of telling the story is he's saying there's the law, there's the spirit of the law. And then there's like why the law was given. Don't you remember when sometimes people break the rules that are set up because the spirit of it is actually life? And so that's why he raises this story, because of course they're not going to argue with the story of David because they're Pharisees and they love David. And so he's basically casting himself in the role of David. And then that mic drop moment, he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In that God's laws were built for the flourishing of humankind. We weren't built for God's laws. That's a reversal. You have so prioritized these things that you've missed why they existed in the first place. You keep honing in, not realizing that these things were built. You know, G.K. Chesterton back in the day said, before you remove a fence, you better ask the question why it was put there in the first place. And it's like, they're not even asking that question. Why were these fences put there in the first place? It was for our flourishing. Sabbath is actually an amazing way to live. But here's the thing about Sabbath that we sometimes forget. Sabbath is something that I think the spirit of is alive and well in the New Testament. But every time in Jesus' life, he moves away from it because people have overemphasized it. And the beautiful thing about Sabbath is it's a critique on two kinds of people, not just one. We notice it's one day, not two. So in America, and Canada, we do Saturday and Sunday. That's because we draw from both Judaism and Christianity, and we take 2 days because we're also, we need 2 days to rest. But the Old Testament's saying 1 day. So here's who it critiques. It critiques the workaholic, and it tells you, by the way, everyone, you need to stop for a day and rest. But it also critiques the lazy person because it says you only rest for 1 day, not 2. And that's the way it's actually set up. Don't just sit around and be lazy. There's stuff to be done. There's kingdom work. So he's saying this was all built because that's the way we're wired. It was made to serve us. We aren't meant to come under its boundary that's going to crush us, is basically what he's saying. And then he says, so the Son of Man, meaning me, is Lord even of the Sabbath. And that is such a pivotal statement because he's saying, these guys are ready to go, who are you saying you're God? You can't be over this. See, these little things, you and I, we look for like Jesus. I've sat in coffee shops and had skeptics look at me and go, Jesus never said, I am God in that order. And I'm like, guys, that wouldn't have even made sense to that culture because many people in that culture think of the New Age movement, think we're all gods. What he said is something very radical to the people he was speaking to, first century Israel. He said, I'm Lord even of the Sabbath. And they're like, holy smokes, this guy just say he created the Sabbath. This is nuts. This is blasphemy. Let's get rid of this guy, which is what we're about to say. So he has this encrypted phrase that you and I might not catch because we're living in the 21st century in America or Canada, but he's saying it in a way that they would understand. Super controversial, like just a bomb going off in their culture. And so he says, I'm even Lord of the Sabbath, meaning I get to I get to revolutionize it, relativize it, and add into it new meaning. And then he says that, chapter 3. Again, he entered the synagogue. And of course, the synagogue were these places. So you'd have like the temple in Jerusalem, but not everybody lived there. If you lived up in Galilee, you would need like a local representation of that mothership, just like multi-site churches and so on. So this was their like town church, their campus of their main church. And he said, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. Isn't that an amazing heart? Talk about the culture that we live in. We basically watch people in order to accuse them. I'll wait for them to mess up just so we can accuse them and ruin their life. And this is what they're doing to Jesus, to see whether he would accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. It's like I love this because he's creating drama, right? He's not like our classic picture of Jesus is like this, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Chuck Norris meets, Tony Robbins, Mr. Rogers, like just talks in monotone and is a robot. Like, come here. He just kind of floats. Like those are the movies. This guy's probably dramatized. Like, come here. Everybody look at me. He's creating drama. Come here, withered hand man. Now, the thing about the withered hand man is not that he's not just like a guy that in our culture, they go, oh, look at that guy with a withered hand. Crazy, pass the lasagna. The withered hand, this is what we got to understand. This is what we miss, guys. And this is why it's a sin to make the Bible boring. The withered hand would have kept this guy out of the community of Israel. It would have kept him out of having fellowship. It would have kept him out of the covenant people of God because you can't touch me with your withered hand. You can't come to synagogue. You can't actually be a part of the covenant people of God. And so with every healing, what we've got to understand is Jesus ain't just healing someone. There's this message behind it which says, I'm reconstituting Israel. I'm reconstituting the covenant people of God around me, and I'm doing it in a way that welcomes in all the people that you made outcasts. It's mind-boggling what he's doing. And so the withered hand is not just a description of what was wrong with his hand. It's saying this guy would have been cut out of the covenant community, and Jesus, by healing him, is bringing him back in. It's a salvation thing. It's an ecclesiological thing, like you become part of the people of God again. So he says, come here. And he said to them, I love this. So he's super dramatizing now. He's just on a stage, got the spotlight on him. He's going, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good and to do harm, to save a life, or to kill? So am I supposed to do good or harm on the Sabbath? Am I supposed to save life or kill on the Sabbath? He's putting them in a weird spot. because he knows they want to accuse him of doing anything on the Sabbath, but they don't want to sound like they're crazy and like, well, you can't do good. So he says, am I allowed to do good on the Sabbath? I love this, but they were silent. I mean, we could go into a whole application on why sometimes our culture and you and I should be silent, because it's the smartest thing we should do. And sometimes Jesus puts us in a place of silence in life. And he looked around, verse 5, at them with anger. That doesn't fit into my Mr. Rogers version of reality. Jesus never gets angry. He just coasts through life. He's never emotionally moved by anything. But he is, because we get angry when we hear about sex trafficking. We get angry when we hear about oppression and injustice and inequality. We get angry at sin. We get angry when our family members are addicts and they mess their life up. We get angry, and here is Jesus doing things out of anger. He's actually so frustrated at the religious elites that are oppressing people and making it so that people can't flourish, that he actually functions in anger. We can come back to that if you want. He's grieved at what? Their hardness of heart. Like, he is just looking through their actions and he's going, you guys, you have hardness of heart, man. Your affections, it's literally the Greek word cardia, where we get like cardiac arrest and doing cardio, but it's not like the pumping organ. It's the seat of their emotions, their affections, their volition, their decisions. And those things, circle the word, they're hard. They're not soft anymore. Go back into Genesis through Deuteronomy. God's big concern is that the people of God are going to get hardness of heart. They're going to be obstinate of heart, and he's going to have to give them a fleshy heart again, a heart that feels something. Is that you? Is that your life? Have you become so hard toward that ideology or that opinion or that person or that event or that thing that you're so hard that Jesus actually looking and going, man, this is frustrating how hard your heart has actually become toward the world. It's frustrating that you've become such a religious person that you don't even feel compassion for people who don't know what you know. They haven't experienced God the way you've experienced him. And you've become hard toward them so that you don't, it's, one of my friends has always said, it's very hard to reach a culture that you don't love. You're never going to reach a culture that you're constantly posited against. Christians enter the culture war and they constantly think, I'm right and those are my enemies. It's like, they're not your enemies. They're people who you're called to love. And what's going to happen is if you posit them as enemies, slowly your heart will harden and you will be useless in the task of reaching them. And so he says, there's anger and grieving. And then he says, stretch out your hand. I love this. Again, dramatics. He could have just thought it in his mind, but he does the whole I dream of Jeannie thing, and it's, and there's noises and right. And so he stretch out your hand. And the guy stretches it out and there's a big audience and his hand was restored. I mean, it's like the king in Two Towers when he's all like, wah, and then it's like slowly he turns like normal and it's like worm tongue gets kicked out or whatever. That's what it's like. And so he says, the Pharisees then went out. So imagine this, you just see a man healed. You just see a man restored back into community. You just see a man come off the addiction. You just see a man restore his family life. You just see a man. And the Pharisees went out and immediately, which is Mark's favorite word, by the way. I think there's 135 times when he says the word immediately. The Gospel of Mark, I'm glad we're doing it as a Bible study because it's the gospel for the person in a hurry. It's go, 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 go. Immediately, immediately, immediately. That's what he loves. They held counsel with the Herodians. Hey, we just saw a guy healed. Let's go hold some council meetings with the Herodians. Now, the Herodians were an official group. So they were actually political power and religious power who worked under Herod, who was the Jewish king at the time. And he had his guys. The Pharisees were unofficial, so they got to hold counsel with the officials. They got to go to the Senate and say, hey, guys, you got to do what I do, or to Congress or whatever. And so and look at this word, they held a council against him. How pathetic and terrible is this? How to destroy him. Mark, he's using words that are dramatic, not just to kill him, not just to see him dead, destroy him. Destroy his life, destroy his physical life, his ministry, everything he's saying. They want to destroy Jesus. And Mark tells us right in chapter 3, this is the story I'm going to tell you for the next 13 chapters. But they want to destroy him in chapter 3. And this is what Jesus has to deal with going through. So anyway, there are lots of angles we could go at this by application, but that's the text in its kind of original setting. And these two controversies of Sabbath, well, they're both Sabbath issues, but one of them is just working on the Sabbath, and the other one is healing on the Sabbath, and the question of whether Jesus has the authority to actually reframe and reconstitute what the Sabbath even is. And I'll end with this around this tension as a Christian, because Jesus, of course, has done this amazing thing that the spirit of Sabbath is still a thing, but Hebrews says we've ultimately entered the rest because Jesus has provided it. And I remember one of the churches that we planted, we don't have any buildings. And so one of the buildings that we got was a Seventh-day Adventist church. And I was preaching through the Gospel of Matthew at the time. For 3.5 years, we went through it. And the first Sunday we were ever there, Seventh-day Adventist church. So this is a denomination that is like the Sabbath, you live and die by the Sabbath. The first sermon in that building, I didn't even clue in. I walked in and it was this text. And I walked in, I started going, Sabbath, that's old school. You don't pay attention to the Sabbath no more. The kingdom's come. What's that, players? You know, amen. And we got an email like, dude, we're going to kick you out of this building. You basically looked at all of our cameramen who work for us and told them that we're all wrong. Like, you got to tone it down. And I'm like, oh, right. Seventh-day Adventists. I'm sorry. That's not what I meant. Yeah. Anyways, so that's the tension of the Christian life when it comes to Sabbath. All right, over to you, bro.
Hey, Mark, fantastic stuff there. See, when you come on the Bible study, we're going to quote from New Testament scholars, Jewish rabbis, but with Mark Clark, you're also going to get an awful lot of movie references, okay? We got Lord of the Rings there, Mr. Rogers, Chuck Norris. We're getting it all here, so take copious notes when you come on the Bible study. So we've had context, we've had text, and now we're going to look at theology, and Mark's going to jump back in a little second with this. What does this actually mean in our formation of belief? In our very first season, when we looked at the book of Galatians, we were like talking about things like pneumatology, eschatology, soteriology. That was like end times, the Holy Spirit, and the whole idea of salvation. But what we're doing here in the book of Mark, and primarily in this passage, we're going to talk about something called Christology, okay? And Christology simply is the doctrine of the nature, the person, and the work of Christ, okay? So we need to have a good image of who Jesus is. And as Mark said, there's many people today, they think they know Jesus, either because they haven't read the Bible enough, or they've just read small portions of the Bible. And that's always dangerous. To build any type of theology, you can't ever just isolate one verse or one passage. But this passage helps us bring up a great Christology and understanding of who Jesus was. Hard Marshall, a great commentator, he said this, by their Christologies you will know them. And that is really important for us. Who is Jesus in our minds? Who is this person called Jesus? Well, Jesus identifies himself as two things, and we're just going to spend some time looking at that just for a moment. He talks about himself being the Son of Man, and then he talks about Lord of the Sabbath. So back to chapter 2, verse 28, it says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Thorsten Moritz, he says this, it is at this convergence of Christ as God and true man throughout Jesus' life that Mark anchors his implied incarnation theology of Jesus. Well, what does that really mean for us? It means that Jesus was fully God and yet he was fully man, and he identifies himself as both. He uses this term, Son of Man, and then he brings in this brand new term, Lord of the Sabbath, and we'll unpack that just even a little bit more, okay? So, I mean, this whole idea of being Son of the Man, I love the way Mark highlighted this in verse 5 again. Let's get this one more time. He looked around at them in anger, deeply distressed at what their stubborn hearts. It's like this, I believe it was like the mix of the divine and the human in at the one time, all of those emotions just overflowing. We can see him fully God and we can see him fully man. Gordon Fee says this, that throughout the Gospel of Mark, there's like three big things that Mark identifies concerning Jesus. Remember this, we're talking about Christology here, the person, the work, and the very nature of Jesus. And Fee says this, he identifies Jesus as the kingly Messiah, and then as the suffering servant. You'll get to that in Mark 10:45. And then also how Jesus keeps secret his identity. And Mark said this earlier on. He just didn't come out and go, I am Messiah, I am God, I'm the creator of the universe. Because at that point, they literally would have killed him and crucified him way earlier. But what he's doing in these things, subtly but blatantly at the same time, he's announcing that he is Messiah, but they just don't seem to get enough evidence or can't get a handle on it to really drag him down at that moment. But it's powerful language that he's using. So he uses the language of the Son of Man. And you're going to read this 81 times across the four Gospels. Jesus is identified and self-identifies as the Son of Man. It's 30 times in Matthew, 14 times in Mark, and 25 times in Luke, and 12 times in John. So I'm going to pull Mark back in here. Mark, do you want to talk to us about this incredible term, the Son of Man? What should we be hearing and thinking of Jesus when we hear the Son of Man?
Yeah, that's the way to ask the question, Andrew, because what should we be hearing? So sometimes we hear, what a 21st century Canadian or American would hear, and that's going to lead us astray, because we always got to go, what is the Bible? What would they, as the first century Jews living in this place, have heard Jesus saying? And so there's a bunch of angles. Theologians, after, in the establishment of the church in regard to Christology, have recognized that some have said, well, Son of God is his divine title and Son of Man is his human title, and some of those distinctions. And I think there's something there. But I also think in the minds of his hearers, they would have gone back to a very famous passage, Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, I'll read it to you because this was very central to Jews at the time. They were, of course, lorded over by the Roman Empire. Daniel was lorded over by the Babylonian Empire. And in the middle of his vision, he says this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be, listen to this word, destroyed. And so think about all of that in the backdrop. Mark has told us they're trying to literally destroy his kingdom. And now we've got the echoes of Daniel 7 in our brain. Here is the Son of Man, the true representative of Israel, the righteous one, coming into the presence of the Ancient of Days, and he's handed this kingdom. Now, this is, of course, just after the story of Daniel as a faithful Israelite coming out from surrounded by the lion's den. Of course, we know that from Sunday school. And he gets in front of the king, and he's vindicated for all of what he did. Now here's the Son of Man surrounded by beasts, Daniel tells us, just before he says, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season. So now it shifts to kind of an apocalyptic telling of the Daniel and the lion's den story. And this faithful Israelite is presented before God, and God gives him a kingdom that will never pass away. So in their brains, they're awaiting this one called the Son of Man. They kind of identified themselves as faithful Israel as that, but now they're waiting one that will be given a kingdom. And so when he comes, he's claiming to be the Daniel 7 guy who rides on the clouds, actually, which is very fascinating. He doesn't ride on the clouds downwards out of heaven to earth. He goes upwards from earth into the presence of the Ancient of Days. And then the Ancient of Days gives him the kingdom that will never pass away. So with all of that piano playing in the background, Jesus shows up and starts calling him that very title. And he's basically saying, you got to recognize this time has come. It's on.
Great, Mark. And all of that without one movie reference. That is pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. So everyone, Son of Man, it's really important that you get this. Part of what Mark is doing is sort of like presenting the incognito Jesus, the Jesus that's staying under the radar. People would have heard Son of Man. They would have heard everything that Mark said. Is this the Son of Man from Daniel chapter 7? Or is this just like the Son of Man, like Ezekiel was referenced in his book as just, you're a son of a woman, you're a human being, or we're all son of men, according to Psalm chapter 8? Or is this the other Son of Man? And this is why they were struggling all the time. Who is this Jesus guy? And that's why they didn't kill him even earlier. But he was like, when we look at this, we can go, oh, we really know what he was saying. And in kind of way, he was saying both, I'm the Son of Man, I'm one of you, but also I'm the Son of Man, Daniel chapter 7. This is epic teaching and epic theology. So let's keep us on track here, everyone. We're developing a Christology. We're not just reading one passage and going, oh, this is Jesus, but it helps us form a theology and a full picture of who Jesus really is. So he's the Son of Man, but then he says the Son of Man is even the Lord of the Sabbath. And as Mark said earlier, this was seismic, that Jesus would himself say, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm coming in and I am taking dominion and ownership, and actually I'm going to redeem the Sabbath and get it back to what I was originally talking about. And Mark, I'm going to pull you in on this as well, because I was looking at this and I thought this was so interesting. I think it was in verse 2 or whatever of chapter 3. It says the Pharisees were there and they were watching, look at this here, to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. And this is mind-blowing, everyone. You got to get this, because the Pharisees at this point, it's like they had faith that Jesus could heal. I mean, this is mind-blowing, because the question wasn't, could he heal? It was, would he heal? And it's sort of like a warped faith that they have, Mark, because most Christians turn up and go, nah, God's not going to work. But yet we call ourselves Christ followers. They would not have called themselves Christ followers, but they actually had faith that he could do miracles.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating, and you start getting into the psychology of it, and they're more worried. You're right. They're more worried. And this is why in Matthew 23, Jesus says, one of the things with Pharisees that's the problem is you major on minor things. You focus on, and what does he say? That great artistic thing. You strain out a gnat. Like, so you have your little strain and you need the water. And so there's a little bug in there. So you strain it out and then you turn around and you swallow a camel. I mean, this was, the imagery is mind, because what he's saying is you're focused on every detail. You're focused on whether I'm picking, plucking grain. You're focused on whether I'm going to heal the guy on a particular day and not on the fact that I can heal a guy. You are majoring on minors, because then he says, once you strain out a gnat, swallow a camel, you ignore the larger issues of justice and faith and mercy. You've literally missed the boat. And I think we can do it too. We tend to think God can't use anybody who's not perfect, for instance. And so we hone in and we go, my goodness, look at, all these great things that have happened, but this person's not perfect, say a pastor or something like that. And we miss that God is behind doing the thing. And sometimes we hone in on, but the mechanics of this or that or whatever, I can't fit them in my brain. So I become doubtful. And that's what they're doing.
Wow. So before we move on to application, just to remind you, okay, this whole idea of Christology, part of Christology, these terms that Jesus has, the Son of Man, he's one of us, but yet, of course, he's completely different in the whole genre of Daniel chapter 7, but also he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Mind-blowing for these people. The Sabbath was so big in their minds. Don't forget, it was the biggest and the longest of the 10 Commandments. So many then of the laws of the Torah were there to explain what the Sabbath was about. And then Jesus just comes in and he claims it. He goes, this Sabbath that you've warped and you've wrecked, and you're working so hard to keep, the whole idea of Sabbath is rest, but you're working so hard to keep the Sabbath. After the Sabbath, you actually need a rest. He said, I'm going to reclaim it and I'm going to establish it once again as my Sabbath. And you're going to see this as we go through the Gospel of Mark, a developing Christology, an understanding of who Jesus really is. So Mark, let's look at this whole idea of application. We've got some great text, some great theology. What does this passage mean for our lives? We don't meet too many people with a shriveled hand in a synagogue. How does this come into our lives practically?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things. First, we got to make sure that we're not messing up, that we're not letting religion mess up relationship. Sometimes in our life, we make sure that all the ducks are in a row, that we know all the right answers, but we've traded a relationship with Jesus, with the God behind the veil, for the rules. And so we're so busy tinkering with the rules. I mean, you take Bible college as an example. You know, you go in there and everyone's sitting around arguing about every little nuance, how many this and what about that, and you'll sit there and it's like, do you guys actually even know the Lord anymore? Like, by the time you're done your 4 years, have you elevated text over the God behind the text? And that can happen in our lives. We can worship the Bible versus worshiping the God the Bible points us to. We can worship church versus the God that church is there to help guide us into. We can worship leaders who are, and we makes these trades because they're more tangible. It's easier I can checkbox whether I paid attention to the Sabbath, but it's hard to checkbox whether my heart, which is what he hones in on later, is actually right with Jesus. So that's a harder gauge, and we don't like that. So we like to be able to measure everything and figure out where we're at with everything. So that it's not a bad thing, but it can become a corrupt thing in our lives, of course. I think one of the other things we've got to be careful of is, like you said, the withered hand. What is it? When we read the Gospels, here's one of the mistakes we make. When you're reading the Gospels with your buddies or whatever, who do you put yourself in the role of? Oftentimes, we put ourselves in the role of Jesus, and we're not supposed to do that. We're the withered hand man, right? We're not Jesus, right? We're like, if I hang out with enough prostitutes, I'm sure they'll come to Jesus. No, you're the prostitute. You're the withered hand man. You are in desperate need of the grace of Jesus, not just once, but every day, to heal you of the corruption of your heart, to heal you of your bad things, the shame, the guilt, the mistakes you've made, the sins that you're a part of. Jesus is in ongoing need for you. You don't need him once and then you move on. So you're the withered hand man. You're the Pharisee. You're the Herodians. You're the crowds. You're not Jesus in the story. When you do that, you don't let Jesus be Jesus for you anymore, which is what you need. And we've got into this mentality because we go, what would Jesus do? And we preach that. What would Jesus do? It's like, bro, you ain't Jesus. That's why Jesus had to be Jesus, right? And so you don't even have the ability to do what Jesus did. You're just hoping he looks at you with your withered life and goes, hey, I'm going to move and heal you. Come here. I'm going to do something with you. I'm going to restore you. And all the addictions and all the mistakes you've made, come here, he says. I'm going to do something with you. In my hands, your life can be restored. In the Herodians' hands, in the Pharisees' hands and religious hands, you're a disaster. You will not go anywhere in life. In my hands, I can do something with you, but not just physical healing, emotional, spiritual healing that can happen in your life. So we got to put ourselves in the right place to then receive the healing and forgiveness that we need, and make sure Jesus is in the right place.
Mark, what I normally forget is that I'm the Pharisee in the story. I'm the Pharisee in that story. I remember years ago reading, John Fisher has a book, and it's called 12 Steps for the Recovering Pharisee. And it's absolutely great insight. Like, step number one is that we admit that our single most unmitigated pleasure is to judge other people. And it's in these incredible 12 steps for the Pharisee that's inside all of us, that's no longer following Jesus, but actually starting to judge him because of his grace and his kindness and the stuff that he's doing. So yeah, that's absolutely.
I think that one thing that we do is I've heard someone I read recently put it this way. They said when we get the mistake. The mistake we make is we mistake discipleship for leadership. And we, guys like us, tend to talk about people, regular followers of Jesus, as leaders. And the mistake we make is most people, Andrew, are just trying to pay the bills and have their marriage not break up. They ain't gonna start a ministry that's gonna change the entire world for Christ. They get to Exodus 14 in their yearly Bible reading plan, and it ends there, bro. They haven't given a dime to the church. They've never been to a community group. And we make it sound like they're not even going to heaven. And it's like, let's not mistake leadership for disciple. A disciple is the withered hand guy or the Pharisee going, I'm going to get up tomorrow. I'm going to try it again. Please, grace of Jesus, do something in my life. Get me back on track. And I think once we start to understand that we're recipients of that grace, I read something today. It said the best saints are people who were the best sinners. And it's like, once you start appreciating that, then like you just said, you don't start judging anymore because you know you're a recipient of it.
Fabulous. We'll finish with this, Mark. I was just at a medical facility yesterday. I was just sitting in a waiting area, and this lady came up. She had the mask on in this season that we're in, and she was a Bayside lady, and she's absolutely fabulous. Loves God with all of her heart. It's just what you were saying. Just the tears came into her eyes as she just started to explain just difficulty and could a husband maybe losing his job and the complexity of life. And simply this is what she said. Would you pray for me? Would you pray for me? Would you keep me in your prayers? And later on when I went home, I was talking to Isabel, my wife. I was talking to Isabel and I just said, my heart went out to her. And I thought, I need to see more people's tears. And it just reminded me of what you said there, Mark, that most people are just trying to keep their lives together. And they're just looking for us not to judge them, but actually to love on them. Hey, Mark, thank you so much for being with us again on Season 2. Episode 2, we're going to continue to go through the Gospel of Mark. And everyone, thank you for joining us. And make sure to watch out for the next episode. And you can catch up as well with the weekend teaching. We're going to cover all of the Gospel of Mark here on the Bible Study.